I have the honor today of introducing our next speaker. His name is Jeremy Anderson, and some of you may be very, very familiar with Jeremy, and some of you may not as much. But I want to introduce you to both Jeremy and to Education Commission of the States. Jeremy is the president of Education Commission of the States, a national education policy organization that serves as a partner to state policy makers. In his role, Jeremy works with all state education leaders, from governors to chief state school officers, which are commissioners in our state, from both political parties, to provide unbiased information, personalized support, and opportunities for collaboration. He is committed to helping states create informed education policy and better education systems for students from early learning through post-secondary and the workforce. Jeremy is in airports more than the office, traveling frequently to visit with Education Commission of the State's commissioners and deliver keynote presentations around the country. And I can really testify to that. When I was named the Commissioner of Education, not the Commissioner of the Commissions, but the Commissioner of Education in the state of Missouri, Jeremy was one of the first to visit Jefferson City, to welcome me to the role and introduce me to some of the work that's taking place. And I'm not sure if any of you follow the work, but the Education Commission of the States puts out a daily report that I read every morning, so it's great to have this connection with Jeremy. He's got a lot of energy and certainly follows through with the requests that are made. Prior to joining the organization in 2012, Jeremy built a strong public service record working with officials in Washington, D.C., with many governors and legislators in states, and with education policymakers across the country. He has served in multiple policy and governmental affair roles for governors on state and national education initiatives, and his passion for education runs deep. He was raised by two amazing teachers in Kansas, and his wife... He'll tell you he has a lot of family here. And his wife is an early learning teacher in Colorado, where they currently reside with their 3 children. Help me welcome Jeremy Anderson.
Well, good morning. It is great to be here, and I was born in Kansas, so I'll go ahead and get that out. I did go to KU. My son has always wanted to go to MU, so there's a trade-off there. But it's great to be here with all of you, and it's great to be able to talk a little bit about some of, I think, the big picture things that we're seeing nationally in education policy, but just as important, some of the changes that we're seeing that are very relevant to what you do every day in your school districts here in Missouri. So I want to start off with a little bit of a roadmap to kind of give you a feel for where I want to head. I want to talk a little bit about what we do with the Education Commission of the States, because we are a service that's available to each and every one of you. But I also want to talk about the changing nature of America and who's in education policymaker positions across the country, because we're seeing changes like we have never seen before. And then I want to finish by talking to you about what those changes do to impact the education policies that you're dealing with in the classroom. So I want to start off with, at the Education Commission of the States, we really look at ourselves as an essential member of all of your team. We were formed 50 years ago. Actually formed when the Civil Rights Act passed Congress, first time the federal government ever stepped into education policy. It had always been a state level issue. And the governors were scared to death. They did not know what the federal government was or wasn't going to do. And for the first time, the governors got together and said, we really ought to have a think tank that helps us in an unbiased way learn from each other. And so the Education Commission of the States was started. We're actually in statute, in law here in Missouri. We're in law in 46 states. You could never get 46 states to pass the same law in a 2-year period. But in 1966 and 67, the governors from both parties did exactly that, and those laws are still on the books. And we really believe in the power of learning from experience at the Education Commission of the States. We believe that the best education policy can only happen when policymakers are learning from each other. That's a really hard thing. I get a lot of calls from governors regularly that says, my state's unique. There's nobody else like us. We're special. And I agree with all that. But then I say, Governor, what are you trying to solve? Well, we want to fix high school dropout, or we want to have a better 3rd grade reading level. And I can almost always show them 7 or 8 states that are already tackling this. Things they shouldn't do because some states failed in their attempt, things they could do in states that are close to what they do. We have commissioners across the country, and Margie is one of ours, and we are so happy to have her as one of our commissioners. But in most states, we have 7 commissioners, and they include the governor, the chief state school officer or education commissioner here in Missouri, The chairs of the Senate Education Committee, the chair of the House Education Committee, higher education executives, sometimes an early learning expert, and business people. And I'll give you a quick little view of kind of what our representation looks like for our commissioners. But I go into a lot of states and I bring my 7 commissioners together and they know each other. But there's always comments like, I haven't seen you since the governor's holiday party last year. They're usually too busy in their own silos to be thinking about how they can be doing beneficial policy changes across the spectrum, from early learning through post-secondary. And that's one of the things that we work hard to bring people together on. We've had some successes here in Missouri and worked a lot with the legislature, worked a lot with DESE on some things, and want to continue to provide some of those services for each of you. Our officers include Margie Van Dieven, and we are excited to have her as our national treasurer this year. She was actually just elected in July, and so we have her along with the Mississippi governor, Governor Phil Bryant, who is our chair. And then we also have Assembly Member Shirley Weber, who is the Appropriations for Education Chair for the state of California. We continue to rotate back and forth with governors who are Democrat, Republican, and we make sure that our legislature is the opposite party. Our legislator who's on our board is the opposite party of the governor who is our chair, and that's really important from a national perspective. So when you think about the next time of policies, we look at education policy through 4 lenses for the states, and these are lenses that are available to each of you. So every morning we put out an email that you can sign up for free, and we list the top 5 education policy stories that transpired across the country yesterday. And those are important because you can look at things and realize what didn't work in Arkansas, or what the school finance litigation in Oregon is looking like now, or what's happening in ESSA policies that are going on in Illinois or any other state. But then we also take that and combine it into 4 categories of research, reports, counsel, and convene. With our research, we actually read every single education bill across the country, every one of them. And we put those in a database. And our database has 48,000 different state education policies in it right now that we've been tracking over 15 years. So when you say you really want to work on 4th grade math, or you're really interested in 8th grade science, we can pull up our database real quick and show you 4 or 5 states that have tried to tackle exactly that. And the theory there is you can learn from that collaborative experience. Did it work in Alaska for what they tried in rural communities? Did it not work for what they tried in Atlanta for something they were looking at in the urban core? And it's really important that you take the opportunity to learn through those. We did a bunch of major upgrades this year I'm going to talk about to that system, but you can track education policies on our website right now from some of the major issues and just get an update on which states have had legislation pass on 50 different education policies. And so when you're dealing with your biggest problems in your school districts, don't just think, okay, how do I fix this inside my school district? Think about what are the policies that are limiting you from finding success to the problem that you're trying to tackle. We actually read all of the omnibus appropriation bills in the entire U.S., every single one of the omnibus appropriations bills. I used to work in the legislature in Kansas. I say this kind of half-jokingly. There's people inside some of the state capitals who don't read all of the omnibus appropriations bills before they're passed. But we read them so that we can pull out certain components of education policy on what was funded and what wasn't funded, and how did that impact outcomes for you 2 or 3 years later. So it's really important to take a look at how we go through that process and how it can help you to do your job better. A lot of times in some states, California especially, when they pass their omnibus appropriations bill, my staff has small parties in the office. That sounds extremely nerdy. But I have a lot of people with PhDs and master's degree in education policy, and they're excited about tracking this information so that you can do your job better. We do a lot of our work around reports. We issued 52 reports in 2016 that are major issues for you. This morning we just released a report on statewide longitudinal data systems. Which states made changes in 2016, which states are making changes in 2017. There's only 16 states in the District of Columbia that actually track student outcomes from early learning through post-secondary. So there's 34 states that could start to look at how do we get better outcomes if we can get a statewide longitudinal database that starts to show where we're making a difference and where we're not. And we send our staff into your state to help you achieve that. We do a lot of work throughout the year working through some of the things on council. And our council is really coming in to help, whether it's a state board, whether it's a new governor, whether it's a chief state school officer, and we do that so that we can bring our technical assistance to you. I've got 9 staff that are out across the country this morning. They're in multiple different states. Some are doing events that are testimonies for legislative hearings, but most of them are doing private meetings on things like, how do you increase quality for your K-3 programs? What are you doing around college and career-ready standards to actually guarantee that your graduates from high school are college and career-ready? We only have 26 states in America that your high school graduation requirements are the exact same thing it requires to get into your state institutions of higher learning. We ought to have 50 states where if you graduate high school, you're guaranteed that you would meet the minimum requirements for post-secondary, and these are the policies that you have an opportunity to really tackle. We also do a lot of work on some of our convenings. We're in states all the time. These are examples from 2016 of all of the states that we did major presentations and testimony in. And we do a lot of this through some of our meetings that we hold nationally to bring our players together. So at this juncture, at 8-something in the morning, on your 3rd day of the conference, you're saying, I'm really listening to a Jayhawk talk about this. But there's a reason I'm here, and it's not just because of Margie. I'm here because of my grandmother. I'm here because of my grandmother, who has been a big influence in education policy in many, many different ways for me and many others. This is Rosalia Anderson. She goes by Sally. We all call her Grandma Sally. My grandmother is 93 years old. She's extremely active. For some of you who may not understand why she thinks education is important, she was the 1942 valedictorian from Tipton High School. Thank you. But in 1942, that was it for her. There weren't opportunities for her to get an education beyond that or do anything more. And she vowed, as she married my grandfather, Andy Anderson, that she was going to find a way to make sure that education was a priority, not only for her family, but for anyone she could touch in Missouri. My grandmother is still alive. She actually helped my grandfather run Andy's Oil and Service Station in Norburn, Missouri for over 50 years, and she now resides in Carrollton. She lives in a somewhat assisted living apartment complex. She really doesn't have any nursing help because she refuses to get it, but she also doesn't have a lock on her door so people can come in and check on her if she needs to in the safe environment she's in. My grandmother had 5 children. They were all born in Missouri, and she strove to make sure that they all received some kind of a post-secondary education and received a meaningful K-12 experience. All 5 of her children married and are still married. And of the 10 children she has, 6 of them are teachers or school administrators. I have an uncle and aunt who just retired from Camdenton School District here in Missouri. They spent their entire education career teaching in that school district. I have an uncle and aunt who taught in multiple different cities across this state, but ended up in Fayette, where they were for almost 20 years, and my uncle actually served as the high school principal there for quite some time. Both my parents are teachers. They went to the University of Kansas, they stayed in Kansas City, but beyond that part, my mom taught for 36 years and she taught special ed primarily with very at-risk juvenile delinquents. My dad taught for 47 years, and he taught gifted and academically talented students. Imagine the conversations at our dining room table. My mom's student got rearrested, my dad's student is winning some kind of an invention contest. But the combination of those are what we want to have in education policy. The ability to learn through those experiences that you're seeing every day in the classroom. And I'm seeing nationally some real difficulties in having those education policy discussions, not because the wrong people are getting elected or getting into office, but because we have a lot of new people who are getting elected, and institutional knowledge is not there. I can learn a lot from my father after 47 years in the classroom. In some states, like with Missouri, the term limits, you lose some institutional knowledge with people who are making some education policies. So you have a much greater role in your positions in school districts than you would in other states for education policy. So I want to talk a little bit about the changing face of who are our education policy leaders in America. And we've seen this coming for a couple of years, but at my office, we've really been looking at a period of 2 years. 24 months that started this January of 2017 and continues until December of 2018. It's a period where you're going to see dramatic change in who are the decision makers for your states in education policy. You may be thinking 2018 elections, that is so far off. It's just 15 months from now. that the 2018 elections will be taking place. And so let me start by talking about the 2016. In the 2016 elections, there were 98 legislative chambers that held elections. Republicans actually did not gain more of those chambers. They did gain a couple, but Republicans now have 66 of the chambers, and Democrats have 31 of the chambers. Democrats actually gained the New Mexico House, the Washington Senate, and both the Nevada House and Senate. Republicans gained the Kentucky House, the Iowa Senate, and the Minnesota Senate. This isn't a partisan question, but it's a major change in who's getting elected. In 2014, we did some analysis, and if you looked at the education chairs for the House education and Senate education in America, 37% of them were new in that role. 4 of those ed chairs were freshman legislators. And so think about what you're trying to achieve to make a difference in some of these students' lives and how you can help those people become better informed and understand what you're doing on a daily basis. We see a lot of changes that are happening with chief state school officers. In Missouri here, it's a position that is actually hired by a state board and works in conjunction with them, but that's not the case in many states. About a third of the states, you actually have an elected chief state school officer, running almost like the Attorney General for Missouri or the Treasurer for Missouri. In about a third of the states, you have a Secretary of Ed who is a member of the governor's cabinet. So it's a direct appointee from the governor. And you have about a third, a little more, that are actually hired by a state board. But even that's different. Some state boards are appointed like they are here in Missouri. Some are elected like they were over in Kansas. And so there's a lot of change that we're seeing. 13 states hold elections, 6 held elections in 2016. And what's intriguing for me is that only 2 incumbents were able to get reelected. The average tenure for a chief state school officer in America right now is 24 months. So the average leader of education in your state is in that job for 2 years. And there's a lot of trends that are being broken, and Margie is breaking that trend right now. But in the big picture, it's important for you to keep that in context when you're looking at what policies you're going to be changing. State boards of education that are elected, there have been dramatic changes. 11 states actually elect their state board members, and in 2016, 10 of those states held elections. There were 46 state board positions that were open across this country. More than half, 24 of them, are brand new members who just got elected. This isn't a political issue, it's turnover that's happening very quickly. And if your state board is very engaged, and sometimes those that are elected become very, very engaged, Utah is an example where 70% of their state board turned over and is brand new with a chief who's been in the job for 7 months. And so this is really important context as you look at how you're going to make changes in your states. Governors are a big one, though, and this applies to Missouri here. Your governor was a new governor who was elected in 2016. There were 12 states that held governor's races in 2016. They ended up with 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats, but there were really only 4 incumbents that got elected, some because of term limits like you had here in Missouri. We monitored Montana very close because Governor Steve Bullock was the chair of our organization at the time, and he barely won re-election in the state of Montana. But when you look at this, there are 8 new governors who took office in January of 2017. And you look at what's ahead, there are 36 governor's races that are going to take place over the next 15 months in this country. 16 of those governors are term limited. They are not able to run for re-election at all. So we know we had 8 new governors in 2016. We know we're going to have 16 new there. The governors of Iowa and the governors of South Carolina both resigned just recently to become members of President Trump's administration. Governor of Alabama resigned because there were some legal issues, and it was better for him to resign than be indicted. But in that capacity, it's a dramatic change in who's leading. We have 27 new governors guaranteed over this 24-month period that I'm talking about. It is rare that you have that much change in education policymakers. What's most important for me is that of those 27 new governors, they appoint 18 of the chief state school officers in America. So when we look at the races across the country, we know that the states in purple will have a new governor during this period. Missouri's included there. We also know that there are a significant number of races that will take place. And in the 2018 elections that are there, the states in green, the incumbent governor could get reelected. But there's only 6 states that we know are going to have the same governor that they had in 2016 in America. This isn't something to scare us, but it's a reality to understand that traditionally, these are education policymakers who are extremely engaged in looking out for long-term legacy issues for education. That will not be the case for the next 2 to 3 years. I've worked in governor's offices. You spend your first year trying to figure out what's up and what's down. You make a lot of mistakes. You don't have the right staff. You don't know if you can trust a budget director or not trust a budget director. It takes about 1.5 years, 2 years for a team to gel in a governor's office. So you're going to play a much bigger role in education policy in your states than potentially you have ever before, especially with the federal government's change in the Every Student Succeeds Act. So why does this matter? It matters because as these changes are happening, we're seeing dramatic changes in education policy, some good, some bad, but many that you can learn from here in Missouri. When we look at our state information requests, these are requests that we get from our commissioners, like when Margie contacts us and says, "Can you help me understand what other states are doing around this issue or that issue?" Last year, we issued over 680 different private memos that we sent back to our commissioners saying, you wanted to learn more about third grade reading standards. Here's an example of 6 states that have made changes. Let us know what else we can do to help you on this. And it allows them to do their job with more information. The top 5 issues that we have seen so far this year, finance is number 1. That is new. It has popped up this year. Normally it's in top 10, but it's not one of our top 5. High school transitions to post-secondary. It is where a lot of states are having significant problems figuring out how do they meet the workforce needs of the next generation. School choice is a big one, but we haven't seen a lot of school choice legislation that's passed. There's been a lot introduced, but there hasn't been a lot that's actually passed in the last 2 years. Every state has some kind of a school choice bill that is passed and is law. Kentucky was actually the last state that just passed something this year. Minnesota was the first state that did that about 20 years ago. But a lot of states, the school choice that's there is a very limited option. It's options for a voucher or charter school, but in a lot of states it's limited only to students who have an individual education plan and not those who are gifted or academically talented. So there's a lot of caveats that need to be looked at around that. We have a lot around assessments and accountability, which you've dealt with more than your fair share of joys here in Missouri, and you're not alone. There are many states in that same capacity. And then teacher issues, especially around recruitment, retention, and licensure. A lot of the states feel that they have one problem that no other state has around teacher issues. The number I like to share in my speeches is that 5 years ago, we had 750,000 college students who wanted to be teachers. They were enrolled in a teacher prep program somewhere in America. Last year, we only had 499 college students who wanted to be teachers. We went from 750,000 to 499,000. That's a third drop in the number of college students who had an interest in becoming a teacher. This is a national epidemic that we're going to be facing for a while here, and it's one that collectively you can have a lot of success with if you're working with other states. We also look at our website on what are the issues. And the issues that our website gets hit on the most, Every Student Succeeds at, of course, and school choice. Our website is a giant search bar that gives you access to not only all of our reports, but to our database and to all of the other legislation. And so I'd urge you to look at it so you can think about how you can bring maybe more informed or more detailed options to your education policymakers to consider. We've seen dramatic change, though, in what's being passed and what's being considered in some of the policies. So around early learning, is there any guess on how many early learning bills were introduced across the country just in the last 6 months? Anybody? Bueller? 125? 1,100. Only 47 state legislatures have met in the last 6 months, and 1,100 early learning bills have been introduced. Those bills deal with everything from K-3 quality to teacher certification to funding to do we provide all-day pre-K, do we provide all-day K, how do we do bonding initiatives to help schools grow if they've got to have all-day K. But 1,100 bills were introduced, and 108 became law in the 2017 legislative sessions as of last week. That's a lot of change on early learning, and a lot of that affects the work you're doing every day in your school districts, yet it's a really difficult issue for many K-12 systems to take on because it's not set up in a way that's simple for DESE or others to embrace all of that. We look at K-12 and what's happening with the ESSA issues. There are 16 states that have already submitted their Every Student Succeeds Act plan, along with the District of Columbia. There's 34, including Missouri, that are going to be heading that direction. This is one of the most dramatic changes that we've seen in a long time in education policy. Last month, my wife and I were so happy when our son graduated high school. It took him a little bit longer than we had thought it might take, but he made it, and he's going to college. But our son's graduating class is a really interesting class because he's one of only 2 graduating classes in America, the class of 2017, the class of 2016, that actually spent their entire K-12 experience under one federal law, No Child Left Behind Act. You can like it or not, but he had 13 years of public education under one federal law that Congress never changed. In that same time period, Apple issued 7 new iPhones. You can make an assumption that it is highly likely the federal government is not going to be changing the Every Student Succeed Act for probably another 8 to 10 years. And so how can you as a state embrace the change that is before you in states actually being empowered to make some meaningful differences in the outcomes for students? You're going to see a lot of states like Missouri who have really, really good Every Student Succeeds Act plans. But some of them are going to look like they're the skinny version. I mean, they don't cover everything that you as a superintendent would like for it to cover. But it doesn't have to because of some changes that happened with the change in administrations and some rules and regs that were taken back. Your plan has to cover everything that's in the letter of the law. And as a state, it goes back and forth on what you want to do, but a lot of states are saying, let's make sure we have conformed to every single word in the letter of that law, but let's not hold ourselves accountable on a whole bunch of other stuff that the federal government really doesn't have to do. We should be doing that as a state, whether that's with DESE or whether that's with legislators or whether that's with all of you or whether that's with the governor. You're going to see dramatic changes in how states go about this. We've had a lot of states that have called us and asked questions like, do we have to keep taking federal funds? And we're like, you don't. There's no law that says you do, but it's linked mostly with the Civil Rights Act, and you probably need to have a law firm on retainer if you're not going to take any federal funds. But we also have a lot of states that are trying to figure out with an Every Student Succeed Act, how do they actually give the districts that are going to have to submit their own district ESSA plan, how do you give the districts the flexibility to actually do what you need for the diverse students that you're trying to teach? And I think in Missouri, you see a lot of that between rural and urban, between some growing demographics, between some poverty and some not so poverty districts. We've got a couple things on our website that I'd urge you to look at, especially as you're thinking about your district ESSA plans that will be due in about a year, year and a half. We have a way that you can track certain policy issues to see what other states have done. This is an example of states this year that passed laws that the goal was to have an impact on low-income students. So there aren't that many that made that change. But our website also now lets you look at those that heard or considered policies. These are states that had hearings or regulations or bills directly on a policy that was linked to getting better outcomes for low-income students. So there's a lot of ways that you can learn from your peers, even if you haven't met who your peer is in another state, and we'd urge you to take advantage of that. We're also seeing a tremendous amount of change on the higher ed side. And while higher ed seems like it's a different silo and it's not your bailiwick and it's not what you have to do, there's a real opportunity to link some of those things so that you can get better outcomes. There's a lot of states that are looking at some creative ways to do some early college high schools, to increase the amount of dual credit opportunities that are available, especially in rural or in very low poverty districts. We see a lot of interesting changes in higher ed law, and the thing that I would tell you is this year there's been 385 higher ed bills that have been introduced, and over 107 of them became law. So 30% of the higher ed bills that get introduced in America actually become law. And so if you're working on those policies, it'd be important to consider them. A couple that we think are very innovative and fun. We now have 22 states that in the last 3 years have passed policies that deal with foster students. If I was a foster kid, I probably didn't have anybody thinking about my college fund or where I would go or what I'm going to do. And so that many states have passed laws that allow for tuition assistance or for tuition to not have to be paid if you are in the foster care system of that state. There's a lot of really interesting policies that are higher ed specific, but have a significant impact in how you can be helping your students in the K-12 arena. And why does this matter in the big picture? It matters because as the Every Student Succeed Act got passed, it was a different Congress, it was a different administration. And the theory was we're going to let states have a little bit more opportunity to get creative, to think about what they really wanted to achieve. But then we had a change in president. And then we've also had some change in rules and regulations. And where things stand right now, states have never been given the amount of power that they have on K-12 education, probably within the last 50 years. And in a lot of these states, you're dealing with really, really good education policymakers, but it's a new governor, or it's new staff that have come in. It's new legislators because of term limits. And your role to educate them and help them see how your district plan for ESSA or how some innovative ideas that you're working on inside your district are making a difference plays a tremendous role in the state policies that we're going to see across the country. You do tremendous work for the students of Missouri, and I think you need to continue to applaud yourself for the outcomes you're getting and strive to set some goals so that you can be at the top 10 in multiple categories across the country on outcomes for those students. Because you've got some great people you've educated before. From my grandma Sally, through my parents, you've got good outcomes, and I hope you can continue to see the successes that I've been able to see through the work that's been done over the years in Missouri. Thank you very much.